it diversely works in two ways. Number one, if there is an offense of money laundering and there is, from that offense, there's generation of proceeds of crime, per se, has been defined in Section 2 of the Act. The idea is that the statute provides that the offender is prosecuted from one way, and the other idea is that he's not allowed to enjoy the benefits of the proceeds of crime that he is allegedly procured. So the first way where the prosecution works is that's a criminal prosecution. And in the criminal prosecution, there's a prosecution complaint that is filed, and that's a proper trial that goes on. At the very substratum of our case study today, we will be dealing with the issues that we find, and there are certain solutions and suggestions also towards the end. But first, the first category that goes on is the prosecution complaint. Meanwhile, under Section 5 of the Act, very importantly, there are attachments to the property that have been procured through the alleged proceeds of crime. Now, as I mentioned, this statute has been amended so many times over the past so many years, and now scheduled offenses were added, and then later on, very recently, many judgments have also come as to what kind of properties can be attached and what actually qualifies as proceeds of crime, and there has to be multiple reasons to believe that has to be given to the offender at the time. When we are addressing the issue of money laundering as of today in India, it has to be, according to me very strictly, it's a very personal opinion, that it has to be an offense-centric approach rather than the offender-centric approach. For example, and I think we've spoken about this earlier also, that when you go on a witch hunt, per se, to prosecute a certain offender, if your principal objective is prosecution towards the end, I think you're wrong. If your principal objective is primary focus is conviction of the offender at the end, I think you're missing the point. See, when we've dealt with cases over the past so many years, and we see that even in cybercrime related matters and phishing matters, and as Sir had rightly pointed out, that there is a timeline that you have to report the crime, and then because you can't trace the money, because there are multiple layering, that is done through bank accounts. I personally feel that if you go on a goose chase after the offender and not after the money initially, you lose out on critical time. And while we'll be addressing certain issues with the statute, I'd also like to point out that we feel that there is also a lack in regional cooperation in terms of money laundering. Very recently, the Supreme Court in India, we were dealing with a massive case wherein a certain developer had sent out diverted funds across Indian borders and to different parts of Southeast Asia. And the bank wherein the funds were transferred had filed an affidavit. And this is sometimes I feel that this is the way the bank had come forward before the Honorable Supreme Court. They said that, look, this money was transferred through wired channels and into our bank accounts. And the client confidentiality that we have in India is completely different to what they have across the border. And that was the limited level of information that they could share at the time with the Honorable Court. However, that matter went on. And that got me thinking that if you're not focusing very initially, very in the nascent stages as to where the money is going and how to trace it, I think that is an issue that has to be addressed. After that, the second most important issue that has to be addressed is regional cooperation. Because let's face it, because we were sitting here and we heard Sir and Ma'am also that a lot of these transactions that go abroad, your traceability becomes bleaker by the minute. It becomes bleaker by the second. So until and unless there is reporting, until and unless there is tracing, and until and unless there is a mechanism in place for governments to work together, or even authorities that can come forward and work together, because not all authorities, for example, the enforcement directorate that works in India, I don't think will work harmoniously and share most informations with an authority that deals with certain kind of offenses across a separate state sovereign border, and that is an issue. So, in order to address that, that infrastructure has to come in play. I understand that we are on a strict time schedule by our friend, so I will now cede the stage to my learned colleague Abhijit. Abhijit will take over and we'll take you through our case study.
Well, before I start, greetings to everyone. Well, I read the room and I sort of glanced at everybody present here. I'm supposedly one of the youngest speakers to address the gathering. And I thank my senior Somesh sir for this opportunity, because certainly at this age, you don't get this chance to, address a gathering as educated and as experienced as yourself. And without further ado, I'll move on to the presentation. So, well, of course, I don't think I'm experienced enough to educate you people about what money laundering is, but I give my best shot to try and bring forward to you people as to what is the genesis of money laundering, and how did various anti-money laundering laws took place across the world, and how did the UN recognized and understood what is the need to take money laundering as a sui generis autonomous offense and not a predicate offense. All right. So moving on with the chapters. So we've broken down our presentation into 7 chapters specifically. And now moving forward. All right. So the history and objective of Money Laundering Act. Now, of course, money laundering has went through several amendments globally and nationally as per the Indian Prevention of Money Laundering Act. But what led to these amendments, and what led to these changes in the or the perspective towards criminalizing money laundering as a substantive offense in itself? Now, when the UN, the first time it happened, when they recognized that money laundering is an offense and that it caters to several offenses indirectly, it was in 1986 when the United Nations Conventions on Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances recognized that the proceeds used from predicate offenses is being laundered to different parts of the world and facilitating other substantive offenses, other scheduled offenses as per several laws. So, series of United Nations conventions and programs went about to make the AML laws, the anti-money laundering laws, as they are today in several parts of the world. Now, when we speak about money laundering, I think it's FATF holds a fair share of gratitude towards controlling, curbing, giving us better recommendations and technological aspects to control and to curb the menace of money laundering. Now, okay, I won't digress much. As I've mentioned, the United Nations Conventions on NDPS, I'll move forward as to how did they think about curbing the terror funding menace. It was in 1992 when they recognized that money laundering is being used not only to facilitate drug trafficking, human trafficking, but also to fund the various terrorist activities. For example, in India, the need for the Money Laundering Act arose when in 2001, on the fateful day of 13 December 2001, a Fiat car, a white Fiat car, rammed into the gates of the Indian Parliament, and they opened fire. The perpetrator of the offense was Afzal Guru, and he was eventually hanged to death by the Indian authorities. But my point here is, while the investigation was going on, in the place where this particular man was residing along with his other companions, they found bags of Indian currency, bags of Indian tainted and unaccounted for Indian currency, which they couldn't trace to any source whatsoever. Now, this is how we think about to criminalize the offense and to take money laundering as a serious offense in itself. Now, the effect, all right. I mean, I don't mean to present you a half-baked cake beautiful but inedible icing on the top, because Indian PMLA is not that effective as of now. I mean, we are putting in constant efforts, and we are trying to strengthen the act as much as we can. But then it still needs a lot of how to put it, a lot of changes in the approach that we have towards, as sir mentioned, the approach towards the offender and the offense per se. Right now, the PMLA works in two different ways. One is the Section 3 prosecution, and the other is the attachment under Section 4, under Section 5, I'm sorry. Now, instead of focusing on recovering the proceeds of crime and sort of compensating the victims, currently what the Indian government and the Indian judiciary is focusing on is to prosecute the offender. That serves no good to anyone but the people who have vested interest in the prosecution of this white collar criminal. Now, moving forward, okay. So, money laundering, for the first time, when UN pressured the member states to take cognizance of this matter and to substantially incorporate laws to criminalize money laundering, was in 1998. The United Nations, I mean, as late as 1998, when terror activities were on the peak of the time, and every country was suffering. That is when they recognize, okay, that we must bring in statutes and enactments to sort of criminalize money laundering. But just look at the approach and the changes. That in 1998 they spoke about money laundering, but they didn't consider the offense, that the money laundering offense is a transnational organized crime. It's not an offense which is specific to a certain nation. So in 2000, the United Convention sat down again and brought in the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime to understand that money laundering is not a one-time offense. It's a continuing process. It's a process that goes from different sovereign nations, and proceeds are laundered to different nations for the purpose of placement. There are three stages, right? Placement, integration, and layering. Placement, layering, and integration. Now, moving forward, I'll just use a presentation. All right. Yeah. So since the theme of the entire conference is cybercrime, it begs the question whether cybercrime is effectively countering the menace of money laundering. In India, even though Sir rightly mentioned about the IT Act and how effectively we are trying to curb the cyber crimes per se, but I still feel that there needs to be harmony between these enactments. There needs to be a sort of cooperative movement towards a single offense. For example, if there's an offense of money laundering, it requires the support of the economic offense wing of the police station, the support of the IT wing of the police station, because money laundering is not an offense in isolation. It requires several offenses that go about and constitute money laundering. Now, when I say that India is, money laundering statutes and other statutes which complement the money laundering statute are still a work in progress, is majorly because the recent amendment in 2019 that brought in to enhance the due diligence of money laundering was the first time when we spoke about tracing the transactions back to the original source. As late as 2019, our country thought about, the very fundamental problem which pertains to money laundering, the tracing back of the sources to the original idea. Now, moving forward with the suggestion, the conclusions. Now, what we believe is money laundering is something which is an offense which is read in isolation in India currently. And what we suggest is that there must be a nodal agency which takes care of all the financial crimes investigation agency, and they must report to their one nodal agency so that there's enough cooperation and harmony in their work. So when they're investigating a certain case, they need to understand that it's not just the EU. So, for example, there has been a very recent judgment in 2018 by the Honorable High Court of Karnataka. It's an Indian state. So the question was whether proceedings under IBC, that is Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, will prevail over attachment of property under Money Laundering Act. Now, what outweighs what in an investigation? which is why we say that there must be a nodal agency which prioritizes and understand that the transaction involved in money laundering is facilitating a major offense, then to compensate the creditors who are losing the money. Now, that is the main suggestion. And moving forward, using this international platform, we can also take this platform and suggest FATF per se, that FATF can act as an intermediary, wherein criminals who are who rush out of countries after perpetrating an offense, they rush out of countries and go to different nations. Extradition is almost impossible for countries that do not have diplomatic tensions. So what we suggest is FATF to act as an intermediary between such countries to looking into the principle of necessity and bringing in the better good out of just not two-state rivalries. And I'll call upon Sumesh sir for the conclusion and the suggestions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Abhijit. We had to kind of rush through our slides a little bit because we had a small time constraint. But to conclude, the idea today in the Indian perspective has to be it has to take in conference some kind of a regional perspective. Because as Abhijit very rightly mentioned, that these funds and these perpetrators usually cross sovereign borders. A second perspective that I really feel is that when you want to investigate money laundering on two different fronts, wherein there is a prosecution front and there is an attachment front, you can't really do that unless you have the correct infrastructure for either. Right now, the current scenario is that you are lacking in infrastructure on both fronts. So initially, even in 2010, there was an MER report by the United Nations, and the mutual evaluation report very clearly suggested that, look, until and unless the predicate offense and the offender has been convicted, you can't start a proceeding for money laundering. And that is where the Indian perspective comes into play, because by the UK statute in the POC Act in UK, they also kind of attach the properties beforehand. But that being said, they have the proper infrastructure already in place at the moment. We don't. So before we take on the menace on two fronts and we're fighting two wars or two battles on two fronts, let's concentrate on either front and then legislate in accordance. And if that is something that is not plausible at the moment, then employ a certain level of infrastructure that can come in and play. Thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. It was a pleasure. And thank you.